Hail, fellow Norathians! Pull up a stool, grab yourself some elven wine, and welcome to the Nokturnal Tavern. Today is August 21st, 2026, and this is episode 002, Ghost in the Trees. I'm Nocturne. Now, before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who has taken the time to listen to the show so far. This podcast is super early stage, and I have been shocked by the amount of people that are actually watching it. I literally was expecting, 3 or 4 downloads, mostly from the people I know in real life, like family and friends. But I'm seeing like 40 and 50 downloads on day one of an episode drop. And that, I don't know if that metric is really as amazing as it seems to me, but right now it feels super good. And I just really want to give a genuine thank you to anybody who is choosing to spend their time listening to me ramble on about whatever it is I'm rambling on about. Starting this week, I'm going to start including a little quick character update so you can kind of follow my progress as I go along. Also, this is kind of for my record keeping, if you will. So I'm going to start adding in little metrics of my character. And this primarily is just going to be like my character level and how much platinum I have. And also any cool things I got up to. Obviously I'm still in the process of leveling, but for right now, we'll just go ahead and get the formalities out of the way. My character at the recording of this episode, my character is level 40. I have a platinum total of 3,100 platinum. That's after having spent about 2,000 platinum leveling alchemy, which doesn't seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things when you're playing the game once you get into like the 30s and 40s. But holy cow, to think back in the olden days where it took me weeks, literal weeks to get even 1 platinum. 2,000 platinum sounds crazy. The really bad news about that 2,000 platinum expenditure is that apparently becoming a respectable alchemist requires like more money than all of New England's annual pothole repair budget. Anyway, so moving on to the agenda for this episode. Today's episode is going to be jam-packed with information because as you might know, we finally got a set of patch notes. Now, this patch note is pretty substantial. Just briefly, it kind of comes with a Castle Mistmoore revamp, some additional explanations about the Bloodmoon merging, and they kind of defined some information about the different instance types, which I'm thankful for. Now, in this week's 3-way theory, we're going to be talking about Paladin, Monk, and Enchanter, the so-called meta spec that somehow like 90% of the people playing it just miraculously fell into it. This week's Ak'Anon Adjustments is going to hopefully fix some of the frustrations that new players have with the chat window when you first log in. And in lore and legends, and I'm kind of proud of this one, folks, we're going to be talking about a bloody battle. But before we get into any of that, I just want to drop a quick tip teaser on you. We got 5 quick tips this week, including a couple here, a way to forage while moving, and a creative use for the quick buff. But first, it's time to handle this week's Bristlebane's Blunders. Now, just to clarify something, every episode that I've launched so far, 2, I listened to it at least 3 times after I've recorded it. I listened to it once on my PC while I'm using my headphones so I can see how that sounds. Then I listened to it on my bedroom TV on YouTube. And I also listened to it on either the Apple Podcast app or Spotify when I'm in my car. Now, I don't do this because I'm trying to pad the numbers or anything. I'm doing this because I want to make sure that it's coming across clear and the mixing sounds right for every one of those environments, because I've found, listening to tons of podcasts over the years myself, that sometimes the mixing is not great for maybe in the car versus when I've got it on my headphones. So I try to go out of my way to do that, to make sure that it's good to go. While listening to last week's episodes, I came across a couple of things that I thought was pretty interesting. So first off, I was talking about the pronunciation of the city Kanos, and I said the comment that I made was something to the effect of, thanks to the hard set in stone rule about the English language having a Q and a U sound, that came off as if I was saying, hey, this is a hard and fast rule, you need to follow it. That was supposed to be a joke. The English language barely has any rules, let alone any that are really set in stone. When in actuality, it seems like the English language has like 14 exceptions and 3 technicalities and words that are just thrown in to confuse non-native English speakers. And then there was the segment that I'm finding so far is one of my favorite to record because I'm writing the script and I can follow the script more closely instead of forgetting little cool things that I thought I was going to say and then never did. However, last week's Lore and Legends segment, boy, I'm sorry to everybody that had to listen to that. Because when I was listening to it, I realized I kind of got into this like circle of repeating something, and it just sounds ridiculous on playback. It feels like at times I'm saying things like fire and ice, but there's hot and there's cold and there's snow and there's lava. And it just felt like this cycle of just repeating different words to say hot and cold. I'm sorry that any of you sat through that, assuming any of you did. Maybe the skip forward button saw a little extra use last week. But I promise, this week's Lore and Legends, way meatier. And I'm actually really proud of this one. I think I finally nailed the atmosphere that I want to go for with this segment. And I kind of do a little bit more of a setup in it so that you understand why I read it so differently than the rest of the podcast. And now for a little backstory on the podcast itself, like its creation and why I'm doing it. I've kind of touched on this a little bit in the past, but I just wanted to clarify a couple of things here. So I got asked specifically why I chose to do an EverQuest Legends podcast instead of a World of Warcraft podcast, considering I've been playing WoW consistently longer than I ever played EverQuest. So this kind of goes back to like, I want to say it was like 2016, 2017. The microphone that I'm currently recording these episodes on is a Blue Yeti. This is pre-Logitech disaster, by the way. That back in 2016 or 2017, a couple of friends and I had decided that we were going to do one of those podcasts where it's, just bros talking about bro shit while being funny. It never materialized because I bought the microphone and I was ready, and nobody was willing to kind of come together on our off time to set this up. So I just kind of had the microphone for many years. And then shortly after that was when I decided to get into streaming, since I figured, hey, I've got a pretty darn good microphone here. And before anybody comes at me about saying Blue Yeti in one sentence that also says pretty darn good microphone, do some research. I'm telling you, the Blue Yetis of today are, I don't even know if they're still making them, to be honest, but man, did they take a nosedive in quality. Luckily mine is from pre any of that. Not that I knew that was going to happen, but so kind of a dour moment here. It was just about a month ago that I lost my father. So it, as I think that does in anybody's case, it causes you to kind of take stock of your life and, realize some mistakes maybe you made in life or some opportunities you didn't take. And one of the things that came out of this was the realization that I've spent the greater part of my adult life trying to uncomplicate things. I struggle sometimes with ADHD-like symptoms, which anybody that knows me in real life or has ever watched me on Twitch can attest to. I get distracted really easily. So I've gone out of my way to stop myself from doing things that will distract me away from whatever I'm trying to stay focused on. So my life has pretty much revolved around go to work, come home, sleep, wake up, go to work, and fill in those times in between with whatever I can, whether it's gaming, family, whatever I can. Now, all of this was going on right as nostalgia came knocking on my door like a 1980s encyclopedia salesman that goes by the name of EverQuest Legends. The idea entered my head that maybe I could do a podcast about it, and then I immediately fell back into my preservation mode, and I was like, well, there's probably too many people already doing podcasts. So I looked, I searched in all the platforms that I was aware of, and I only found one. It was a podcast by the name of Return to Norath, hosted by a guy named Anthonius, who's already been running a very successful, long-running podcast called Classic Gaming Today. Now, I've listened to every episode of his podcast, Return to Norath, and I've really, really enjoyed them. If you're listening to me and not him, you're definitely doing yourself a disservice. Return to Norath is like the maglev bullet train to the Nokturnal Tavern's handcar. Listening to the first episode of Return to Norath with like an ear towards, how do you make an EverQuest Legends podcast work? That gave me enough of a confidence boost to be able to decide, let's go ahead and let's start heading down this path and stop trying to uncomplicate things. Let's complicate things way more than they ever needed to be. And now to address the other part of that question, which is why EverQuest Legends podcast versus a World of Warcraft podcast. Now, before I even get into that, I just want to state, I still love World of Warcraft. As I was writing the script, I was watching the Race to World First that's currently running on Twitch. Go Team Liquid, by the way. However, I've noticed over the years, the last couple of expansions, I've been kind of falling into a pattern of falling in and out of love with WoW throughout the expansion. Now, I enjoy when a new expansion launches. Absolutely, that's my favorite time of the game. But it's as that expansion wears on, or the patch cycle wears on, they start introducing more and more systems, and they start building up on top of each other. And then whenever you have somebody like a friend or whatever that wants to jump back into the game, you try to explain to them what it is they need to be doing. And my God, you find yourself just running in circles trying to explain all the different systems. Well, you can't do this until you've done that. And then even worst case scenario is something is phased out and you spend an hour trying to figure out why they can't see the NPC that they need to see. And it just starts to wear on you. I think it's just becoming a case of being overwhelmed by all the system mechanics and the temporary currencies and honestly, the repeated mistakes that Blizzard keeps making. And then, Blizzard will come out for the millionth time and say, oh, well, we've listened to the feedback from the player base and we agree that, fill in the blank with whatever you want there. But I'm growing tired of hearing them go through this constant cycle of an expansion where it's oh, here's this new system. Oh, we screwed it up. Oh, okay. Now that the players have provided feedback and now we see what you want, we're gonna tone things down. Now, EverQuest Legends has the potential to stay clear of that entire disaster because it currently doesn't exist. There's not any real systems to speak of, the kind that I'm talking about. But I will hold judgment until they've shown that they will steer clear of those problems. What I will boldly proclaim right now is that the game is still in this phase where you just go out, you kill mobs, you gain experience, you get a new level, and then with that new level comes new skills and spells. And then that's it. The rest of it is just take in the capital E experience that is EverQuest. Now, for some people, the exploring and experiencing EverQuest comes with, remembering what it was like back in the old days. I actually kind of fall somewhere in the middle. There are places I remember, there's zones I never went to, there's zones I didn't spend much time in. So parts of EverQuest, and more importantly in this case, EverQuest Legends, are a first time experience for me too. But for a lucky few people out there, this isn't just their first time seeing some of these zones. For some people, this is the first time they're experiencing anything to do with EverQuest. And holy cow, can you imagine that there's also people out there that this is their first MMO? So they're not even understanding like the basic tenets of an MMO. And I am envious of those people because that's the phase of an MMO that I like the most. I like when everything is very simple and it's literally just go explore the world, and along the way you're getting XP and gaining levels. I'm also not so naive as to believe that phase is going to support EverQuest Legends, or really any MMO for that matter, for years. Or I mean, and let's be honest, with the way people burn through content, even a couple of months. So why start a podcast at this point in my life? Because frankly, I'm not getting any younger, and I need just some sort of a creative outlet. I hate using that phrase. It sounds like a cliche, but I don't have a better way to say it, so I get to use the cliche. I needed a creative outlet of some type, and I'm not an artistic guy, so this is how I could be creative. And to answer the why EverQuest Legends versus World of Warcraft, at the moment, it's WoW fatigue. And it's the new fresh coat of paint on an old friend. And when that old friend is EverQuest, you should probably check whether that fresh paint is covering a hidden wall or a false floor. And that brings us to Norathian news. We had a pretty substantial set of patch notes this week, because, especially considering it's only been 2 weeks since the last one. Now, after they released the patch notes, they then went back and added a couple more clarifications, one of which I'm glad they added, actually. It doesn't seem like they needed to, but I'm glad they did it. We'll get to all that towards the end. The first headline of the patch notes is Mistmoore Castle has been revamped. So I'm just going to read the notes and then I'll comment when I feel like it's appropriate. Mistmoore Castle has received a major upgrade. In addition to named NPCs being guaranteed spawns, they now all have a guaranteed loot drop of a common or rare item with stat bonuses. While some of these items are familiar to explorers of the castle in years past, many are brand new. Some include exciting new effects ready for you to enjoy as they are, or turn into exaltations. All named enemies in the zone have now been designated as rare creatures, vastly increasing their chances of dropping motes of potential. Additionally, the residents of the main castle are now somewhat less aggressive and will not react to your presence from extreme ranges during the daytime. Exploring the castle at night, however, will still be a harrowing affair once the castle denizens have shown their true forms. Now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in Castle Mistmoore back in the old days, and I haven't been back since joining EverQuest Legends, so I'm probably not like the best person to be able to compare what the revamped version versus the old version looks like, but I'm kind of excited to get in there. Like, I like when they do these revamps. I view it as like an opportunity to see into what the developers have in mind for what they want future content to look like. Fractional UI scaling and cursor scaling. The UI scaling system now supports fractional UI scaling in quarter increments, 0.25 increments, ranging from 0.75 times to 4 times. The cursor now has its own scaling factor in the in-game options, which can be found at O. A toggle now exists in the in-game options, O, to use the operating system cursor rather than the in-game cursor. Now, I'm super glad they added that because, cursor scaling is very much needed, especially considering the aging player base, myself included. But I do want to take this opportunity to go on a small little tangent here to highlight a contribution from a community member. This person, as far as I know, has no affiliation with Daybreak Games or Game John. They're just a fan that wanted to create a project. Now, this fan-made project is called the EverQuest Legends Companion app. This app does 1.5 million things, but specifically to the point of this patch note, it gives you an option to put a ring around your cursor. That ring can be, the size of the ring can be changed, the thickness of the ring can be changed. the color of the ring can be changed. It also comes with a shadow outline on it, so that even if you choose a color that ends up, you know, fading into the background of the game, the shadow allows it to kind of pop out of the background. The EverQuest Companion app was created by a guy named Josh Moyers, and I only use his real name here, not because I'm trying to out anybody, but there's, in any situation where you're talking about software development nowadays, with the advent of vibe coding, it becomes the responsibility of people passing along the information about these apps to do their due diligence and ensure that this isn't just something that was vibe coded by somebody who has no clue what they're doing in coding. And I'm guilty of doing that myself. I've coded add-ons for World of Warcraft. I made a thing for EverQuest a couple of years ago that would automatically read what zone I was in out of the log, and then just update a source on my Twitch stream, so people didn't have to ask what zone I was in. It would just constantly update as I zoned. But I can't share those with anybody because I don't know what's really going on in that code. I can run it through a checker or whatever, and I still don't know what's going on. So I'm only passing along his real life name because he has associated himself with the project through his GitHub, which, you know, he's also got a bio on there, and it says he's been developing software for 22 something years. And from a average person's perspective, it appears to be on the up and up here. So you don't have to worry about vibe coding. This guy's like a legit programmer. I will include the link to his GitHub in the show notes, as well as a link to his YouTube channel. The name of the channel is Shot Logic, spelled exactly the way you expect it would be, where he's kind of describing, you know, what it does, what his thought process is on when he's making stuff. I love, absolutely love when software developers kind of give us that insight. So again, that's the EverQuest Legends Companion. Go give it a look, folks. I guarantee you, you're going to find something about it that you find very useful if it's not just the ring around your cursor. And moving right along in the patch notes, we have a gameplay update. This one says, you will no longer gain skill ups from skills you haven't used when riposting. Or riposting. I don't know how to pronounce the word. Just what I've always said is riposting. Now, I had noticed that I was getting like random skill ups in. I want to say it was hand to hand that I was getting them in. And I was definitely using weapons that were not hand to hand. So I'm guessing that this thing that this patch note is fixing is what was causing me to get those skill ups. And next is a patch note that I love the way they worded it. It says, creatures in the plane of fear and beyond should no longer fear or charm you so hard that you're unable to approach the game for 24 hours. I gotta ask, was this actually happening? Like, you just couldn't log in for 24 hours, or could you just like not go to those zones? Like, I want to know more. Inquiring minds want to know. And here are some spells and AA patch notes. Targeted area of effect lull spells, such as Harmony, can now take effect on NPCs you have not engaged in combat. Well, I think that explains why I was seeing people say that Harmony wasn't an AoE anymore. It was single target. Turns out it was just broke. There were also some changes to Shadow Knights and Necromancers, specifically pertaining to their life draw effect spells. And now for the more contentious patch note. The Wasp and Bees of Plane of Sky have had their stingers filed down while charmed. The Wasp/Bee in Plane of Sky, known as Murder Bee, should be a bit easier to exterminate in solo instances. Shimmering Meteors have also had their damage tuned downwards while charmed. Okay, here we go. There have been a ton of misinterpretations and drama, for lack of a better word, regarding this change in particular, talking about fun detected and, you know, the fun police and this, that, and the other thing. I just want to go on the record as stating the following. These are targeted changes towards a specific mob that was being used in ways it was literally never intended to be used. So the specific enemies these were enemies that were doing way too much damage when they were charmed. Game John decided that they needed to be pulled down a notch or two. But the amount of dooming going on over this being the end of the game and proof that the developers hate fun is just literally laughable. I don't have the crayons or the inclination to explain why changes like this need to get made. Because for the people who need to reconsider the way they think about this change, they just never will. You're never going to change those people's minds. They're going to find something else to complain about immediately after. But the rest of us will just continue enjoying the game without those people around, hopefully. Okay, so let's get back to the tone that I want this podcast to have. Another official patch note was they fixed an issue where high-level named monsters in Kedge Keep were taking an excessively long time to respawn. Now, my question is, it just says high-level named monsters. Not every named monster is a rare, right? Like, I could be wrong, but I think there are named mobs that are just not rare. So I guess my question is, are they saying rare monsters or just the named monsters? If anybody has any insights, shoot me an email or whatever. I'd greatly appreciate it. And in yet another case of Game John trying to sabotage my podcast, I'm joking, of course, they've made some of my comments from last week obsolete. I'm glad they did, because this is a much more elegant solution, specifically pertaining to the Soldier's Brooch, however you want to pronounce it. The Soldier's Brooch quest in Wrath Mountains, it'll now allow the player to choose their reward. I wanted to try to get in and try that quest turn-in one time before I recorded, but I just never got around to it. I want to see the user interface design they did for this. Like, are you just looking at like 10 or 12 different items that you just choose one, or is it like a much more clunky hodgepodge kind of system? There's been a change to a couple of items, specifically the Guise of the Deceiver and the Amulet of Necropotence. The official patch note states, corrected an issue that allowed player illusions to be used as pet illusions. Now, as evidence that Game John does not in fact hate fun, they added a conversion button to the menu system when you right click and hold to pull out like a clicky effect or a worn effect. And when you click that conversion button, you'll get an item in your inventory called Guise of the Deceived. Then just open up your inventory, go to storage, and then underneath storage will be the activated items tab. Place that Guise of the Deceived into that tab, and then under inventory where you have the pet tab, underneath there will be a drop down called Pet Illusions. You just select that and then summon your new Dark Elf pet. And now a speed run of a few of the patch notes. Bloodmoon now has the focus effect, improved Vampirism 3. Player pets are now prevented from equipping secondary only items when they utilize a two-hander in their primary hand. All context menus will now be fully kept on screen. This includes the spell list when you right-click an empty gem. And a batch of new maps have arrived for the maps window. Now, I'm glad to see them working on new maps. You should have, in a modern MMO, you should definitely have maps of every zone you're in. But it sure would have been nice if they'd have just given us like a list of what those maps were. And also a quick note about the menus dropping off of the screen. I definitely ran into that problem myself. I would constantly have to like move windows up higher on the screen so that I could read the bottom options. I'm glad they fixed this, because this is one of those things where if a new player encounters that, they're just going to assume that the system is broke. And if they assume it's broke, A, they're never going to interface with that system again, or more detrimental, B, they're just going to be like, well, this game is borked, I'm not going to play. And then they just leave. So again, I'm glad to see them make this correction. And now, because apparently I really like punishing myself, I've decided I'm going to try to further explain something about the Bloodmoon weapon and its new focus effect that should go horribly on a audio only podcast where I can't show visually what I'm talking about. But it's specifically about the merging of the items, because previously the Bloodmoon had no focus effect. So any new ones you receive do have the focus effect on them. And there is the possibility of merging them in the wrong direction, so to speak. So as an example, let's say you have a Bloodmoon +4 that has no focus effect on it. So you've had it for 2 weeks, let's say. And then you get now, after the patch, a new Bloodmoon at +0, but it does have the focus effect. What you need to do is open the merge window of the Bloodmoon with the focus effect and drop the +4 one that doesn't have the focus effect into it. And that will result in a +4 with focus effect. And good luck trying to figure out what I meant with that description, everybody. One of the clarifications that came out after the patch notes specifically pertains to what the different types of zones mean, so to speak. Now, it does come with a specific caveat from the developer's post. It says, this next explanation originally came from secrets during the beta, but it still provides a useful breakdown of what the different zone and instance labels mean. So it's specifically talking about like what the instances mean to the player. So a public instance is there's no raid bosses and it's tuned for group content. A personal solo instance means it is no raid bosses. It may contain optional tuning for solo content accessible via the red difficulty button. The personal multiplayer instances are no raid bosses and they're identical to the public instances in every other way. Those are also accessible via the red button. Raid solo. These have raid bosses, normally substantially less trash, with minis and raid bosses present, tuned for solo content, and these are accessible via the voidling things, the little black goopy things that stand at the front of an entrance. Raid multiplayer, those instances have raid bosses, they have some trash, they have minis, and there's no guarantee how much trash will be present, but these are tuned for group content, and these are also accessible via the voidling. Now, each of these types of instances have two further clarification options. They are spawning and non-respawning. Obviously, respawning means the mobs will respawn, which if you don't know, they respawn kind of quick, probably a lot quicker than you're used to. The non-respawning zones, the NPCs obviously don't respawn, but there's a boosted named creature rate, which I would love to see more of like the math behind that, because I feel like in the respawning instances that I've been in, it's just non-stop named and rares. And for this week's quick tips, I've got a collection of 5, starting with a forage macro. This macro is only 3 lines long, or 2 if you choose to include the pause command at the beginning or end of the first line. But the first line should be /do ability forage. The second line is pause 6. And the last line is auto inventory. I'll have the actual text of the macro in the show notes. Now here comes the part that makes this macro so much more useful. Put that macro button on one of your hotbars, just anywhere, it doesn't matter where. Just remember which number it is and what the button number of that bar is. Then go into your key bindings and bind that hotbar button's primary and secondary keys to the same keys you use for, I don't know, left and right movement. Because EverQuest Legends allows duplicate key bindings, every time you turn left and right, you'll also be attempting to forage. And because of the auto inventory command at the end, it just immediately will drop right into your bags. This lets you work on your skill of forage and also just gather a ton of stuff without ever putting any thought into it. Next, let's talk about quick buff. We've discussed quick buff before, but I recently found a very creative use for it. I didn't come up with this. I saw it online somewhere. I wish I could remember where, but normally you can't apply an invisibility and an invisibility versus undead on yourself at the same time. But if you memorize both versions of invisibility and then activate quick buff, they'll both land because quick buff casts both of them simultaneously. The only downside being that quick buff has a 10-minute cooldown. This next quick tip is for any budding blacksmiths out there. Stop selling your fine steel weapons to a vendor. I know they sell for a lot of platinum, but there's a better use. And that better use is put a fine steel weapon and a water flask, not a pot of water, but a water flask into the blacksmithing trade skill container, and you'll receive high quality bricks and pieces. Speaking of weapons, have you ever had one drop and wondered what it looked like? And you know, with the way that the trading system works in this game, with you can only trade something one time, you probably don't want to bind it to yourself just yet. So you want to see what it looks like, but without it now being stuck on your character. Well, if you just hold Alt and right click the item, a little visual preview window will pop up with your current character holding the weapon. Or this also works for gear as well. So any armor you have will do the same thing if it has a visual appearance. And for the final quick tip of this week, you ever out walking around and you see somebody dying and you can tell they're not going to make it. So you try to jump in and you can't kill the mob. That's part of the encounter locking system that this game has. Now that player could yell using the \yell command, and that kind of unlocks the encounter. Which allows others to attack. I don't believe they would get XP for it. It just allows them to kill it. I also think the person who did the \yell also doesn't get experience. Otherwise, I feel like that could be easily exploited. However, you could bypass all that. Just heal the person. If you have a heal, just heal the person. Sometimes, especially the newer players to the game, don't know that there's a \yell command or that is what would save them in this case. So just toss that newbie a heal, would you? Do you want to know what kind of player is never going to find themselves in that kind of situation? It's the player who's playing as this week's three-way theory trio: Paladin, Monk, and Enchanter. Oh boy, here we go. So to be clear, I've never really played Enchanter, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, please. But at first glance, I feel like this trio seems a little weird. I mean, I don't know. I guess honestly, all of these trios in this game seem a little weird, but let's discuss this one in particular. The Paladin survives through the use of plate armor, the fact that it can heal itself, and it also has a bunch of defensive spells. It has some pretty decent little damage abilities also, very specifically towards undead. The Monk does avoid damage. It just doesn't have all the armor class benefits that the Paladin brings, but it does avoid damage, and it also does pretty respectable melee DPS. The Enchanter then walks into this trio like a straight Chad with crowd control, haste, mana regen, and that crowd control comes in the form of mesmerization and charm. So you can mez a giant group of mobs all at once, and then also grab one of those mobs and turn it into your pet, essentially. For solo content, this trio is just freaking unstoppable, like literally. And like I just alluded to a little bit ago with the Paladin, when you're fighting undead, the Paladin just becomes probably the biggest powerhouse in the game. That little specialization that Paladin has also means a lot for the leveling game. Because if you look at like the recommended leveling paths, everybody's telling you, oh, go to Befallen, nothing but undead. Go to Unrest, nothing but undead. Lower Guck, nothing but undead. Like you're going through locations, and these locations have gear you want, that the Paladin is just going to shine like a holy beacon of light. And then when you factor in the Monk's AA called Unbound Alacrity, you can, if you max that out, you're gaining an additional 10% melee haste, like, which you have Enchanter in this group who's also giving haste. I feel like you're going to hit the haste cap like really, really quick with this trio. Now that Enchanter is also bringing the mana regen. So the Paladin, as your source of healing, now has a much larger effective mana pool. This is like a very complete solo package, which explains why it's the meta. Let's not forget that each one of these classes has their own version of the proverbial oh shit button. The monk has the ability to feign death. Okay, it has a lot of option to fail. But if you're then using the enchanter's mesmerization, that is the AoE mez, now you can feign death and just wait for all the mobs to walk away. Instead of them pounding on you, hoping your feign death goes off, you mez everything, wait till they're all just standing there clueless, and then feign death. Also, the Paladin is no slouch in this department either. They have Lay on Hands. It's a complete heal on a long cooldown, but in EverQuest Legends, you get the ability called Smite, which lowers the cooldown of Lay on Hands. And I can only speak to this from the Shadow Knight's perspective. And I can tell you, I am able to use my harm touch way more frequently than I ever thought was going to be possible. When I read the description, I was like, oh, okay, so instead of every 7 days, I'll be able to use it like maybe once a day. It's crazy. On long fights, I'm using it multiple times. So Paladins are getting that ability Lay on Hands multiple times in long fights. Oh, and I forgot to mention, and I had no idea this even existed, but apparently enchanters get an ability called Trickster Misdirection. It's an AA, and this is insane. It's like, if you're familiar with World of Warcraft, it kind of reminds me of like a target dummy. It creates, they use the term simulacrum. It's like a copy of yourself or whatever. So it creates a simulacrum of yourself, and then you like shoot backwards away from the simulacrum, and it causes all the mobs that were right there to focus on that. So with this combination, you cast that ability, all the mobs focus on that, you're now 20 feet behind everything, and then you just feign death and wait it out. Like, it's super crazy oh crap buttons available to you with this trio. Now, as I'm sitting here recording this, I can hear in my own voice, I can hear it. I get frustrated because I chose what I remember being as the most dominant 3-person group that was available to me. And I just chose those 3 classes as my class here, thinking I will be unstoppable. And I was wrong. I am very stoppable. But this class, I need to go on record as stating, this trio, I should say, is unbelievably good. I don't know that I'll ever play it personally, but when it comes to solo leveling, this thing is unstoppable. When it comes to solo farming of endgame content, just watch YouTube or Twitch for more than 10 minutes in the EverQuest Legends channel, and you'll see it's what everybody is using to do that content. Now, that's not to say that there's not other trios out there that are just as powerful and easily able to solo just as well, but this is the one that is the flavor of the month, although it's the flavor of the last couple of weeks, I would say. So here's my cut to the chase take on this 3-way theory trio. Overall, I would call it a super strong and super versatile solo build with a higher than average skill requirement. Like, you got to know what you're doing. It can control and survive failed pulls and do respectable damage while doing it. Just be prepared to use more than 3 of your buttons, because apparently choosing these 3 classes is going to make you busier than a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest. All right, folks, it's finally time for this episode's Ak'Anon Adjustments segment. Let's go on a little imaginary ride for a moment. Let's imagine there's this mythical thing out there called a new player. They're coming to EverQuest from another MMO, let's say, and they've cut their chops on the MMO scene in a modern MMO, and they decide, you know what, I got to see what all the hype is about here with this EverQuest Legends that everybody's talking about. And they come into the game And maybe eventually at some point somebody mentions, hey, a lot of the information you're looking for is down in your chat window. So they look down at the chat window and holy cow, the absolute menace of a window that chat window is for them right now is just unprecedented. Today's Ak'Anon Adjustments segment, we're going to try to wrangle up that chat window into something that can actually be utilized and doesn't strike fear into the heart of every person that looks at it, like the Eye of Mordor. Now, I just want to go on record yet again as stating this is another one of those topics that's going to be kind of difficult to truly get across here in an audio-only podcast, but we're going to give her the old college try. So just to kind of paint the picture again, when a new player joins, or the first time you load up the game, even if you're not a new player, you're going to be looking at a single window, I believe. Maybe there's a second one, but I think it's just one window where literally everything's going there. There's all the different chat channels, all the spell information, all the melee information, whatever your pet is doing, that's happening in that window also. So to clean this up, we're going to need to move some of that garbage into other windows. And you can just right click on the tab and say new tab, or you can say new chat window. Most of my chat windows have multiple tabs on them, but I want to be honest with you here. I don't want to try to walk you through copying exactly what I have because everybody's different. Everybody wants to see different information. So I'm just going to kind of give you some guides on how to set it up. And let's be clear, once you start digging into this, you'll see that some of these options, especially like the melee and the spell filters and hits modes and those kind of things, there's thousands of them, it feels like. So you just have to play around with it. But I have a little trick that I think is a great workaround for that and has helped me throughout the years figure out what I want where. So to get started, first off, my main chat window is where I generally have like the basic information that I just regularly want to see. I have a specific tab for combat on that main window. I also have another tab that handles like the server-wide channels that I've joined, but since I almost never want to see that, I that's just hidden, or not hidden, but it's not the one that I'm currently clicked on. So that's also where I just kind of put anything I don't ever want to see ever again. I then have another chat window that is for my guild and group chat, and that's all that goes to that. And then I have my secret weapon. I call it Chat 4. It's basically like a testing ground. So if I find a filter or something that I don't know what it does, but I want to see if I need it, I'll move it over to that window. And over time, I'll just kind of test it, see how it works. If it's something that I realize I don't ever want to see this again, boom, going over to the server-wide channels tab that I never want to see. Or if it's something I do need, then I can figure out what tab or window that it should be going to. But I kind of view that one as like a test bed, if you will. So that's my setup kind of at a quick overview. You can set it up however you want, obviously. Like you might find things way more important to the way you play the game than to how I play the game. I think the important part and the big takeaway here, if you just never bothered to think about it before, is try to find a way to separate the information into places you would naturally look on your screen for that information. Bro, let me tell you, I had to take a little pause because I realized I have about 4 or 5 more pages of a script written breaking down all the different melee filters and spell filters and taunt messages and everything else. And I gotta be honest with you, man. In the words of sweet Georgia Brown, ain't nobody got time for that. So instead, I'm gonna leave you with this little note. You're just gonna have to dig around in there and just, like I said, use a dumping ground tab or window or whatever to see what these messages do and figure out for yourself if you need them or not. I can't believe I wrote all that. That's horrible. I expected somebody to listen to this. Okay, I think it's time to leave all the tech behind us. Let's leave all the menus, the filters, and the chat windows behind, and any mistakes we might have made in that department, and move into this week's Lore and Legends segment. This week, we're going a little bit darker, but I also have quite the preface to give on this one. So as what I think is going to become the standard for this segment, I'm going to be reading from the script that I've written to include the little preface that I'm giving. I feel like there's a lot of stuff in there that was going to be very easy for me to forget, and I don't want to leave something out and have everybody going, what the heck is going on right now? Okay, so before we actually get into the lore and legends this week, I want to explain something that I'm going to start doing with this week's episode of, or this week's segment of lore and legends. When the Ruins of Canark expansion released, the manual that came with it had a piece of lore inside of it. It was only about 2 or 3 pages, maybe 4 pages, and it was called A Weary Traveler's Journal. Now, the journal was written from the perspective of an unnamed adventurer. They've never named who it was since, but they were a member of a group called Evil's Bane. Now, I couldn't figure out if they were saying they were just an adventuring party or a guild or what they were, but whatever it was, they went by the name Evil's Bane. Rather than just dumping a bunch of history about Canark onto the player, the manual let this unnamed traveler kind of tell you about it in like an in-universe way. He wrote about his companions, their journey, the people they met along the way, stories that he learned along the way, whether it was, from a written text or whatever. And I've loved the way that they presented that material ever since. So we're going to borrow it. From this point forward, when we open Lore and Legends, I want you to imagine that somewhere along the way, we've managed to get our hands on a few lost pages of the Weary Traveler's Journal. Pages that, for whatever reason, just never made it into the Canark manual. Now, there's one thing I do want to establish before we actually start doing this, and that is you're going to have to give me a little bit of wiggle room with the Weary Traveler himself. The history we're telling will still be grounded in actual lore of EverQuest, the characters, the places, the events. When I can find sources that give us actual spoken words by characters involved, then I'm going to use those. But for the sake of just telling a good story, I'm probably going to stretch things here and there a little bit. And what I mean by that is, like, if something happens during the Weary Traveler's lifetime, which I've also kind of fabricated, then I'm probably going to put him in that event. He might just be standing somewhere off to the side. He might just be watching the events unfold. He might be running for his life along with everybody else, but he'll be there. And if we're talking about something that happened long before his time, then we'll just assume it's a story he heard in a fireplace retelling, or maybe something he found written in a journal that he found somewhere else during his travels. So please forgive the license I'm going to be taking with some of the storytelling, but I think experiencing Norath's history through the eyes of someone who was there is a lot more interesting than me just reading a wiki page entry to you. So with that explanation out of the way, let's open the journal. And for the first of these somewhat recently discovered pages, we're going back to Kithicor Forest. There was a time when darkness in Kithicor Forest meant little more than the setting of a sun. The trees were still the same trees. The paths still wound their way between the Commonlands and High Pass. And when night came, you didn't fear what might be waiting between them. I remember that Kithicor. Or maybe, after everything that's happened, I just prefer to remember it that way. Because there are places in Norath where history leaves behind monuments, ruined cities, broken towers, names carved into stone. Kithicor was given something else. Kithicor was given ghosts. And the story of how that happened begins beneath Highkeep with a goblin named Nurgle. Nurgle was a miner of the Pickclaw tribe, The pick claws worked the mines beneath Highkeep, pulling ore from the earth and selling it cheaply to anyone willing to pay. Humans, Fairdal, and quietly, the Teardal. Nurgle apparently preferred the Dark Elves. They paid better. I suppose everyone has standards. One day, Nurgle's pick struck something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something hard enough to bend the tool in his hands. Buried within the rock was a faintly glowing blue sphere, roughly the size of a small dinner plate from the Nokturnal Tavern. Nurgle didn't know what it was. He only knew he'd never seen anything like it, and something that rare had to be worth money. So he took it to Tirana Slil. Tirana was the Teardal ambassador in Highkeep. Officially, anyway. In truth, she also served Neriak as a spy and broker. When Tirana examined Nurgle's discovery with magic, the sphere answered with a flash powerful enough to burn her fingers. And that's when she realized the goblin had found something extraordinary. She looked upon the stone and exclaimed, "By Inaruk's hand, this is no mere metal." She questioned Nurgle. Where had he found it? Was there more? Nurgle didn't know. But Tirana knew enough. The stone, and word of its discovery, had to reach Neriak. First, she convinced Nurgle to show her exactly where he'd uncovered it. And once he had, Nurgle had outlived his usefulness. Tirana returned to Neriak with the sphere and placed it into the hands of Larthik Kashin. But whatever reward she imagined waiting for her, she received no such reward. Instead, Larthik ordered her straight back to Highkeep, and he sent no orders with her. Orders Tirana would never deliver. There were people watching the Teardal even then. Felon in Deepwood, an operative of Tunair's martyrs, had noticed Tirana's sudden journey to Neriak. When she returned through Kithicor, Felanin and those who had joined him were waiting for her. The fighting was brief. Tirana fell, and among her possessions, Felanin found Larthik's orders. That was when we learned what Neriak intended to do. The Teardal were coming for Highkeep. Now, if you've never understood why Highkeep was worth marching an army across Antonica to capture, look at where it stands. Highkeep wasn't simply another fortress. Control Highkeep and the passage through High Pass, and you control one of the most important routes between eastern and western Antonica. Neriak understood exactly what that meant. If the Teardal could seize Highkeep, they could strengthen their own position while driving a wedge between Kanos and Freeport. They wanted a stranglehold over the races they considered their enemies. And they weren't just sending some raiding party to accomplish it. Neriak was preparing for war. Word spread quickly. A council was called at Highkeep. Lord Tethys and Carson McKay begged the other powers of Norath for help. And what followed was, well, perhaps the most Norathian response imaginable. Everyone had a reason they couldn't come. Kanos feared that committing its forces elsewhere would leave the city vulnerable to enemies at home. Freeport was so divided between its own factions that neither side dared leave the other unattended. Even my own people back in Paladin decided the possibility of an approaching Teardal army was an excellent reason to remain exactly where they were and defend Butcherblock. As a Paladin of Brel, I'll leave you to imagine how proud that made me. I understood their reasoning. Understanding it didn't mean I had to agree with it. At least one dwarf at the council apparently shared my frustration. Thubber Axbringer was there representing Caladim. When the erudites explained that their council would eventually discuss whether they might perhaps eventually consider sending assistance, Thubber had heard enough. The way you blasted erudites discuss things in your meetings, we should be getting help just about this time next decade. I liked Thubber. I didn't know him very well, but at that particular moment, I would have bought him an ale. But beneath the arguments, we were afraid, because while we debated, Neriak wasn't debating anything. Rumors were spreading that the Teardal had united behind someone they called the Child of Hate, Lannis Tavil, the daughter of Inaruk. And if those rumors were true, Carson McCabe understood exactly what that meant. We weren't preparing to face a handful of Dark Elf war parties. We might be preparing to face the whole of Neriak. Then two figures stepped forward. Galeth Verideth, High Paladin of Tunair, and beside him, his student, Firiona V. Galeth brought the first good news we'd heard in some time. The Paladins of Tunair were coming. All of them. Their legions were already crossing the Ocean of Tears, and then more news arrived. Adventurers from across Norrath were volunteering to fight. Dozens of them. People with no kingdom ordering them there. No army compelling them. Just people who understood what would happen if High Keep fell. I know something about trusting the people beside you. My years with Evil's Bane had taught me that much. Different people from different places, walking the same road because we'd chosen to walk it together. But this was different. These weren't companions I'd traveled beside for years. Most were strangers. People who might never have shared a campfire, a drink, or even a friendly word with one another before that day. And yet, here we were, standing together because Neriak had given us a reason to. My own people in Caledon weren't sending an army. But nobody in Caledon had forbidden one stubborn paladin from picking up his shield and going anyway. So I went. At the time, I remember thinking that made me brave. Years later, I've come to believe bravery is simply what we call it when somebody is frightened and goes anyway. And I was frightened. We all were. But we went. The morning the Teardal came was cold. And it rained. I remember that. Of all the things a man might remember about the beginning of a war, I remember being cold. Lannis Tavil and Larthik Kashin led the army out of Neriak and across the Common Lands. Those who tried to stop them were just swept aside. They left forces behind to prevent anyone from following them from the east. Then the rest entered Kithicor. And once beneath those trees, the army spread. A Teardal force slipped into Rivervale and occupied it. The rest continued west, toward High Pass, toward High Keep, toward us. Elsewhere in the forest, there were no lines anymore. No advancing army, no retreating army. Just fighting. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone would scream an order, and you couldn't tell whose voice it was. Steel rang out in the darkness, then another scream, then silence. Then it would start all over again somewhere else. After a while, you stopped trying to figure out who was winning. You stopped thinking about the battle at all. You listened for footsteps, for movement in the brush, for anything that told you which direction the next attack was coming from. And I remember looking at those trees. Trees I had passed beneath 100 times before, and realizing I didn't recognize Kithicor anymore. The forest hadn't changed, not yet, but we had, because every shadow looked like something waiting to kill you. Every sound meant something was coming, and every tree was just another place for the enemy to hide. Kithicor wasn't a forest anymore. It was the battlefield. And even after all these years, sometimes I could still hear it. Near the entrance to High Pass, what remained of us gathered with the Paladins of Tunair. Lord Tethys was there, Galeth Verideth, Firiona V. Then the animals came. They poured through the forest ahead of the approaching Teardal, running from something we couldn't see yet. Then we heard it. Marching boots, weapons, armor, and somewhere among it all, the occasional scream. The army was coming. And there, beneath the trees of Kithicor, they finally found one another. Lord Tethys stepped forward to meet Lannis Taville. The leader of the Fair Doll stood across from the Child of Hate herself. Whatever armies still fought around them, whatever cries carried through the forest, for that moment, their war had become something much smaller. Two figures standing face to face. Tunair and Inaruk. Fedark and Neriak. Everything that had brought us into those woods seemed to narrow down to the space between them. Nearby, Gareth Verideth found his own opponent, Larthik Kashin. Galeth was the High Paladin of Tunair, seasoned, respected, and already carrying more years than perhaps any warrior should have carried into a battlefield like this one. I was a paladin myself, though Brel and Tunair had set us upon very different roads. But standing there, I didn't see a paladin of another faith. I saw a man who had made the same promise in his own way that I had made in mine. Stand between the danger and those who cannot. Across from him stood Lerthik, the Teardal who had been entrusted with that strange blue stone brought back from beneath Highkeep. Neither man needed to be told what came next. And then there was Firiona V. Still young, still Galeth's student. Standing among people whose names already carried histories of their own, while her story was just beginning to form. She stood behind her mentor and the paladins of Tunair as the forces of Neriak closed around them. Lord Tethys before Lannis Taville, Galeth Verideth before Larthik Kashin, Firiona V among them. And somewhere beyond those names history would remember the rest of us. For one brief moment, the people who would shape what happened next stood beneath the same trees. Then Lord Tethys raised his fist and called out to Lannis. By the grace of the Mother, you will be stopped, Child of Hate. Lannis laughed, and then Kithicor erupted. Lord Tethys met Lannis Taville beneath the trees of Kithicor, and for a time he held against her. But Lannis was the Child of Hate. Every attack seemed to come harder than the one before it, until finally Tethys fell. I remember seeing Firiona move toward him. Maybe she thought there was still time. Maybe we all did. But there wasn't. And when Firiona realized that, Lannis was already running for her. Now it was Firiona V who stood before the Child of Hate. And watching the two of them fight, I don't know that I could imagine two people more different. Lannis fought like fury given flesh. Every strike carried anger behind it. Every attack seemed meant to end the fight immediately. Firiona gave her none of that fury in return. She waited, watched, defended herself when she had to, gave ground when she needed to, and then waited some more. I carried a shield long enough to recognize what she was doing. Firiona wasn't trying to match Lannis's fury. She was surviving it. Waiting. Letting the Child of Hate spend herself against every defense Firiona put between them. And slowly, it began to work. Lannis was slowing. The attacks that had come so quickly were taking longer. The fury was still there, but the strength behind it was beginning to fade. And Firiona knew it. Then, the fight changed. Firiona stopped giving ground. She attacked. And Lannis Taville, the Child of Hate, began moving backward. For the first time that day, I think some of us allowed ourselves to believe this might actually end. That we might survive Kithicor. We should have known better. Because somewhere nearby, Galeth Verideth was losing his own fight. His battle against Larthic Kashin had gone very differently. Galeth had experience that few warriors could match. He was a paladin of Tunair. I served Brel. Different gods, different people, different roads that had somehow brought both of us beneath the same trees. But there are some things one paladin recognizes in another. Galeth wasn't fighting because he believed himself invincible. He was fighting because there were people behind him who needed him to stand. But faith doesn't stop the years from finding you. And the longer they fought, the more the advantage shifted towards Larthic. Then Lannis called out for her mentor. Larthic heard her. And whatever restraint remained in him disappeared. He struck Galeth down. The High Paladin fell, unconscious. And everything changed. I didn't understand what I was looking at when Larthic reached into his armor and produced the sphere. Why would I? It was just a blue stone. The same strange object Nurgle had pulled from beneath Highkeep. The same object Tyrannus Lil had recognized as something far more powerful than the Goblin Miner understood. The same object that had been carried all the way back to Neriak. We had fought an entire battle while that thing waited among us, and none of us knew what it was really capable of. Then Larthic raised it towards the sky and called upon Inaruk. Inaruk, in the name of Lannis Tavil, I beseech you, attend her. There are moments from that day that have faded. Faces, voices. I couldn't tell you anymore exactly where I was standing when some of it happened. But I remember that stone. I remember what happened when Larthic called the Prince of Hate. The sphere answered. A rift tore open to the plane of hate. And Larthic had called upon something he could not survive. The power he'd unleashed consumed him. Lannis was drawn upward and disappeared into the rift. And suddenly, the battle we'd been fighting didn't seem to matter anymore. Terdal, Fairdal, paladins, soldiers, none of it mattered. Because something else was coming. Something far worse than either army had brought into those woods. Furiona saw it. Maybe she understood it. Maybe she simply understood just enough. She turned toward everyone still standing in Kithicor and screamed, "Flee! Flee for your lives! Doom approaches!" A paladin is taught to stand, hold the line, protect those behind you. Brel had been the foundation of my strength for as long as I could remember. And a dwarf raised beneath the mountains of Kaladin learns early that stone doesn't run when the storm comes. It endures. But there comes a moment when standing isn't courage anymore. Furiona knew we'd reached it. I've heard men shout warnings before. I've heard commanders order retreats. I've heard people scream because they were afraid. This was different. I've heard warnings your ears hear. And then there are warnings some older part of you understands before your mind is caught up. Your body simply says, run. So we ran. Furiona went to Galeth and helped her fallen mentor to his feet. Those who could still move fled. And behind us, something descended upon Kithicor, Inaruk's army. I wish I could tell you exactly what it felt like, but I can't. I remember running. I remember the trees. I remember trying not to look behind me. And I remember, absurdly, thinking of Kaladin. Stone walls, firelight, the sound of a hammer against an anvil somewhere beyond the door. Home. Perhaps when a man believes he is about to die, his mind simply chooses somewhere else to be. Mine chose Kaladin. And then I remember the silence. When it was over, there was no victory celebration. Not really. The Teardal had failed to take High Keep. Those of us who survived eventually gathered near High Pass. What remained of the Dark Elf army withdrew toward Neriak. We were alive. And for those of us standing there, that had to be enough. And behind us stood Kithicor. The same trees, the same paths, the same forest we'd entered before the battle. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. But standing there looking back into those trees, I knew. We all knew. That wasn't our forest anymore. I told you there was once a time when darkness in Kithicor meant nothing more than the setting of the sun. That time was gone. The forest had been touched by hate. And when the daylight fades, the dead rise beneath its trees. The fallen wander the roads where they had once fought. Their war continuing long after the living armies had gone. Footsteps move through the forest. Distant figures pass between the trees. And travelers who enter Kithicor after sunset find themselves surrounded by soldiers from a battle that has already ended. Night no longer simply falls upon Kithicor. Night awakens it. Sometimes I try to remember what the woods used to sound like. Birds overhead, wind through the leaves, footsteps on the road. Normal things. It's strange what you forget, because when I think of Kithicor now, I hear people screaming somewhere beyond the trees. I hear footsteps just behind me that I can't place. And I hear Firiona screaming for us to run. I've traveled many roads since then. My journeys with Evil's Bane have carried me farther from Paladin than the younger dwarf who first took up a shield ever imagined he'd go. I've seen places I once knew only from the stories of travelers passing through my homeland. But Kithicor follows me. And sometimes, when the sun begins to disappear behind distant trees, I wonder how much of what I hear is just the horrifying memory of that day, and how much of it is actually still there. There was a Kithicor before Bloody Kithicor. Remember that. Before the armies, before the dead walked beneath these trees, before hate touched the forest, there was simply Kithicor. And beneath High Keep, the goblin miner named Nurgle swung his pick into the earth and found a strange blue stone. He couldn't possibly have known what he'd uncovered. None of us did. But by the time we finally understood, the Kithicor we had known was already gone. And Norrath would never see that forest the same way ever again. So that's the narrative story that's actually in Norrath. But there's a part about the Bloody Kithicor event that I think makes this story so much cooler. Players were actually there for this. It's known as the Battle of Bloody Kithicor, and it was brought into EverQuest through a GM event. Now we're talking early EverQuest here. I believe it occurred on Halloween of 1999. And I want you to think about what playing EverQuest was like during that time. Nobody had the 27 years of accumulated EverQuest knowledge that we have now. There were no decades worth of wiki pages or YouTube videos. For the players that experienced this in-game event, the world was still fresh and new. And suddenly, the world started doing something. Players weren't simply just being told about something that was terrible going on over in Kithicor. They actually experienced the Battle of Bloody Kithicor, as it's called, in the game. And then when it was over, Kithicor had changed. That is the part that I absolutely love. Because those undead soldiers that would come to define how Kithicor is at night, those weren't just mobs that some developer or designer just dropped into the zone because they were like, hey, let's make the run from Common Lands to High Pass suck a little bit more. Although mission accomplished. There was a story behind that. That battle happened. Kithicor got corrupted, and now, every night, the dead show up. The aftermath of that story became part of actually playing EverQuest. We talk about living worlds in MMOs all the time, but I wish I could have been there to have experienced that story unfolding in that zone, and it now still to this day having after effects that are still being felt by brand new players that come into the world and they accidentally find their way into Kithicor at night. And you don't have to have participated in the event to see the effects of it. You don't need to know the story I just told you. You just have to stand at the entrance of Kithicor and wait. Because sooner or later, the sun's going to go down. And the forest is going to tell you something crazy happened here. I love that. Normally, this is where we would check the Kainos message board, but when I checked the post box this time, i.e. my email at nocturnegaming@gmail.com, there was nothing in it. So there's really not anything for this segment today. But if you have a guild announcement, a community event, just maybe even like a question, a listener question, or anything else you think belongs on the message board, send it my way, and we'll see about adding it to the Kainos message board for next week's episode. Now, this week, we do actually have something for the new and old friends segment. It's actually a personal one. Last week, I talked about the tribute video for my old guild, Celestial Rising. While I was going through the names in that video, I came across one that belonged to someone that actually I had gotten into EverQuest sometime around 2000, 2001. I'm not exactly sure when, neither is he. But that character's name was Pavaran. Seeing that name again made me wonder whether he might be interested in trying this version of the game, or maybe he was already playing. I don't know. So I reached out to him over Facebook, and we talked for a little while about EverQuest Legends, and the many, many years that have passed since the last time we spoke. And, you know, forget the EverQuest thing. It was just good to reconnect with him after all that time. He's such a good dude. And I don't know whether he'll decide to give EverQuest Legends a try. He hasn't spoken to me about it since then, so I don't know if it's going to happen, but I'm hoping at some point, maybe I'll be wandering around Norrath and I'll just see the name Pavaran walking by again. Although, to be completely honest, I don't feel like I get a lot of time to play the game anymore with production of this podcast, especially this episode, which is creeping up on an hour and a half at this point. So with that being said, I think I'm actually going to wrap it up here. So if you're enjoying the show, please toss us a follow so you don't miss the next episode. You can listen to the Nokturnal Tavern podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and on YouTube, which, for the record, was a pain in the rear end to get set up. You can also find me on Twitch at Nocturne13. You can find me on YouTube at Nocturne Gaming 6000. On X or Twitter, it's at Nocturne Gaming 1, the number 1 at the end. On Instagram at The Nokturnal Tavern, and on TikTok at Nocturne Gaming. Man, that's just a mouthful. Like, there needs to be a better way to plug your socials when there was no way to grab the exact same username on all of those platforms. All right, ladies and gentlemen, with that, The Nokturnal Tavern Episode 002, titled Ghosts in the Trees, is a done deal. This one went about as long as I thought all my episodes were going to go. So I'm kind of happy with the way this has turned out. And I hope you're enjoying the shows as much as I'm enjoying making them. And if you are enjoying the show, please toss us a follow so you don't miss the next episode. If you have a moment, I would also greatly appreciate if you could leave a review for us, apparently over on Apple Podcasts. That's about the only way I'll get any kind of findability over there. And also maybe share the show with somebody you know in real life who might enjoy spending some time here at the old tavern. Thank you yet again for listening. If you've made it this far, congratulations on not falling asleep. And remember, whether you're in Norrath or that overtuned raid boss called IRL, keep your aggro low and your spirits high. and we'll save your spot here at the bar. Thanks again, folks. Catch you next week.